Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Discover New Sounds video for the major blues scale. Now, I've done a Discover New Sounds video for the minor blues scale, but they're different. So the minor blues scale is built on a minor diatonic scale, and it's got a kind of like all minors, kind of has a real emotional, a lot of depth of feeling to it. Where this scale, the major blues scale, is built off of the major diatonic scale, which major scales are a little bit lighter and brighter, so it's kind of a little bit of a lighter side to a blues scale. Now, one of the biggest advantages of learning the scale on the native flute is it gives you another key to play in. So the minor blues scale starts on this low note, where the major blues scale starts on this note. And this is the relative key on your native flute. So anytime you're starting on this note for a scale, you're playing in the relative key. And there's more on that on the Discover New Sounds page for this video. At the bottom of the web page, it talks about how to know what key you're playing in when you're playing the relative key. So another thing is if your flute has the leather covering the sixth hole, you'll just need to uncover that. So I'll play a little improvisation on this scale, and then I'll show you the fingering chart and kind of talk about the scale a little bit. And then I'll play some more improvisations on it to give you some more ideas. So this is the fingering chart for the major blues scale, and as it's titled here, the relative major blues scale. And what the relative part is you're playing in a key that is relative to the kind of baseline key that your flute plays in. So with all the holes covered, that's that baseline key that your flute plays in. When you open that first hole on the bottom and you start there, now you're playing in the relative major key. Because native flutes are based in a minor key, when you open that hole up, you move to the relative major key. And if you want to learn more about that, there's a ton of information online about the relative major key or the relative minor key. If you do a Google search for either of those, you'll find a lot of information on there about that. There's also some information about that in the bottom of the Discover New Sounds webpage for this scale, and it tells you, I talk a little bit about how to know what key you're playing in when you're playing in the relative major key. Additionally, I talk about this in the Discover New Sounds video for the relative major diatonic scale, so you can learn more about it there as well. Now, I think the biggest challenge about learning this scale is the cross fingering, going from this note to this note. So if you haven't played with cross fingerings before, I think it would be good to just start teaching your fingers how to move back and forth between these notes. Just kind of go real slowly back and forth. You're just teaching your fingers the dexterity of this, and then doing it faster and faster. And then the next biggest challenge is then just to remember to not go all the way down to that low note. So I often find when I'm learning a new scale like this, I'll print this out or make a diagram of the fingering chart, and I'll have it in front of me. And then as I'm playing, I can see it, and I can see notes to jump around to, and it reminds me of what notes are in the scale and which notes aren't. So which notes to stay, which notes to play, and which notes not to play. Now, as I'm looking at this, I'm recognizing that the third hole from the top is closed to the whole thing. So in the beginning of the video, I said if you use the leather tie to remove that, and I'm noticing now all of a sudden I thought that I was using that note, and I'm not even using that note. So it's really helpful to be able to visually see the scale like this. And so if you have the leather tie off and you prefer it to be on, go ahead and put it back on. We don't use that note in this scale. Other than that, the next challenge, I think, is going over the octave. So going from this note to this note. And while the fingering isn't complicated, you're actually just dropping these two down. There's two things. One, the dexterity of that, teaching the fingers which fingers to go down, it's different than if you're just used to playing the pentatonic minor scale. It's really different. This is not a fingering pattern that's in that scale. So you might need to just teach your fingers how to make that pattern. And the next thing that I think most people tend to have more of a challenge with is popping the flute up over the octave. So a lot of times you'll have to do a little bit of a harder tonguing right here. More of a ta ta than a ta ta. Really emphasize the tonguing to pop your flute up over the octave. Really depends on the flute. Some flutes will jump over the octave really easily. Others, you really have to emphasize it. So you'll have to just get to know that on your particular flute. Now, if you're playing in a bass tone flute, sometimes even the F sharps, like I think of them as almost in that bass tone range. For that over the octave note, for this note here, you may need to try this fingering here in order to have the note be a little more true. On most of the bass flutes, it's going to be flat, and so you're not going to be able to really get that high note. That said, playing up to that note is still amazing. It still gives you a ton to play with. And you can still hit that upper note, and it will probably sound okay. It just depends on your ear, and it depends on if you like it or not. If you're playing with other people, like another instrument, or you're playing with another flute, and they're in maybe like a different octave range, it might not sound as good. So now I'll show you a visual version of this fingering chart. I'll show you visually on the flute what this scale looks like. Now, if you know the minor blues scale, you'll notice that it's really similar. It's actually mostly the same fingerings, except that you're going over the octave for one note, for that high note, and then you're not going to the lowest note. So it's really similar. And so it's just something to note that even though you're playing in a totally different key, a lot of the fingerings are the same. So if you know the minor blues scale, this scale will be a lot more straightforward to learn. So you can also go back and forth between the major blues and the minor blues while you're playing. You can kind of slide back and forth between the two. But you got to do it in a way where you really know the difference, where that tonic note that in the major blues, which is this note here, still sounds like the tonic note as you continue through the song. So because that is really when you play this, when you're playing in that scale, like when you're using that series of notes, that's the bass, the root note. And so you want to play things that accentuate that tonic note, that give that feel of that ending on that scale where there's resolution on that note, not scale, on that note. And then when you're playing the minor blues, which starts on this note, you know, all the holes covered, it gives you that feeling of the finality on that tonic note, which is easier to hit because the flute tends to move towards that, especially if you've been playing your flute for a while. Your songs all end there in general, and so that has that feel to it. So you can kind of move back and forth between the two, but you want to be able to still accentuate those separate tonic notes, really give it distinction that you're playing between, you're now in one scale and then you're in another, and then you're moving back to the other kind of thing. So here's an example of that.